Hello, everyone. My name is Chris Kiesling, Director of Archives and Special Collections. On behalf of the First Fridays Committee and the Department of Archives and Special Collections, welcome to First Fridays Online. Today's presentations will be posted later on the University Library's YouTube channel, so you should be able to access them within the next few weeks. First Fridays is a monthly series of presentations made possible by a generous gift from Governor Elmer L. and Mrs. Eleanor Anderson in honor of former library director, Dr. Edward B. Stanford. The presentations are based on materials in the University Library's Archives and Special Collections. A special thank you to Alan and Jason from Middle English Interpreting, who will be providing ASL interpretation for today's presentation, and to Mike Sutliff, who is providing tech support. The University of Minnesota Twin Cities is built within the traditional homelands of the Dakota people. It is important to acknowledge the peoples on whose land we live, learn, and work as we seek to improve and strengthen our relations with our tribal nations. We also acknowledge that words are not enough. We must ensure that our institution provides support, resources, and programs that increase access to all aspects of higher education for our American Indian students, staff, faculty, and community members. If you have any questions for our speakers today, please submit them using the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. Please use the Q&A function and not the chat function so that we can keep track of your questions. You can submit your questions at any time, but we will hold them until the end of the presentations and answer them as time allows. Our presentations today are by Linnea Anderson of the Social Welfare History Archives and Ryan Bean from the Couts Family YMCA Archives. Their topic is Disrupting the Narrative, Documenting and Advancing Institutional Change Through the Archives. Linnea and Ryan will explore stories of the evolution of racial narratives in the social services and events of the past when those narratives were challenged. They will consider what is the role of archivists as caretakers of these documents and what role can these documents play in disrupting the narrative. Take it away, Linnea.
Thank you, Chris. What do past moments of change and disruption in the social services look like? What were the strategies and priorities? This talk explores just a few of the stories in the Social Welfare History Archives that are waiting to be explored, analyzed, and shared. These narratives demonstrate challenge and change, but also point to how systems perpetuate themselves and the ongoing nature of the issues, many of which may sound familiar to you. Before we move on, an acknowledgement that there may be harmful, racist, or outdated terminology in the records, some of which are quoted in the presentation. In particular, the sources for this talk use the words ethnic and minority when referring to communities of color. The records in SWHA document the complex role of social work in establishing and enforcing systemic racism, but also in fighting it through social action and social justice movements. There is not time to explore this complex legacy fully in this format, but I hope that these examples will inspire further research. Much of this presentation is based on materials that were scanned as part of the Umbra Search African American History Project and are available online. I invite you to explore and share them and to realize their potential as powerful conversation drivers that are applicable to current work. I'm going to discuss two broad themes on social work and racial justice and present brief related examples. These are my first impressions, and more work needs to be done to fully understand these initiatives and their impact. The first theme is using authorized programs within the profession to promote desegregation and civil rights and to foster what was often known at the time as intergroup relations. These cover the 1950s through the 1960s. The second looks at challenges from within the profession to established concepts, priorities, structures, and relationships as part of Black Power, anti-racism, and systems change movements in the later 1960s and 1970s. Social service organizations used a number of strategies to promote civil rights goals, including national initiatives to foster change at the local level, community organizing, and intergroup education and dialogue. An interesting example of how a national desegregation initiative worked locally is the Racial Inclusiveness Project of the YWCA branch of the USO. The project worked with local USO clubs in the 1950s and early 60s as part of a national directive to desegregate the USO. Project files include questionnaires filled out by local clubs. Their brief answers show reactions ranging from acceptance to resistance to caution. A 1962 report shows that only 5 clubs out of roughly 115 surveyed that year still had activities defined as completely segregated. 22 had separated facilities, and I have not worked out yet how that is different than segregation. And 66 have some integrated activities, and 23 integrate all their activities except social dancing. And we'll come back to that later. A quick review of local responses highlighted a few themes or questions behind these numbers. The first is the power and persistence of segregation. Some clubs explained that Black service members used the USO club on base because there isn't anything for them in town. Does this indicate segregated communities and businesses surrounding military bases or hostile local attitudes? It also raises questions about the issues related to operating an integrated program within a segregated community that is definitely grounds for further research. The records also provide more direct evidence of persisting segregation. In some cases, local clubs explain they don't have any Black members because there's already a program for the Black service members, also known as segregation. The project also encouraged having more Black staff and volunteers. And some clubs answered that there were no Black staff or volunteers because they could not get to the club, or there wasn't anyone available in the area, or at least no one who was qualified, which begs the question of whether this project also included a review of qualification and gatekeeping practices. Do these types of responses point to segregated housing near the base or issues with access to transit or other barriers to this kind of integration? The questionnaire also listed specific types of programs, and clubs were asked to indicate whether these were fully integrated, never integrated, or partially integrated. And one thing that stood out was that most clubs did not have integrated social dancing, even clubs that integrated all their other types of programs. USO clubs were spaces occupied by service members, women volunteers, and young women called junior volunteers. And this may have been perceived as a potentially volatile mix when implementing desegregation. And I think that it reinforces the need to explore how racist attitudes or participant needs and views impacted these types of projects. These examples are just some of the many contested spaces and barriers that appear when looking at how a national program worked in a local setting where segregation was prevalent and powerful. Another example of a national initiative with directives to local members is the National Social Welfare Assembly's Committee on Intergroup Relations, established in 1955. The committee charge lists eliminating prejudice and discrimination as a clear and unquestioned obligation. The committee had the power to conduct periodic reviews and also worked with agencies in an educational capacity. Initiatives included intergroup camping and other integrated youth activities, drawing on the local community for board leadership, encouraging a policy of non-segregated meetings, and fostering intergroup relations through local programming. The committee polled member agencies on their plans to integrate. The agency comments give a glimpse into how this initiative was carried out and how some of the programs may have been experienced by Black participants, keeping in mind that these are the official responses. For example, highlights and comments from agencies suggest that there were instances where Black participants were viewed as pioneers. This is a word used in one of the reports, brought into existing systems. The records raise questions such as who was the primary beneficiary of these programs and who was in a position to determine who benefited and whether they were successful and how the programs were experienced by their participants. Social workers also used community organizing to work for civil rights and voting rights. The National Federation of Settlements Mississippi Project, which started around 1966, presents an interesting and well-documented example of this. Much of the material deals with the creation of the Tri-County Community Centers in 3 counties in Mississippi. The project fostered grassroots leadership for social change, community employment, and electing Black residents to political office. It established training committees and boards made up of community members to make decisions on their programs. Applying for grants, summer programs, and family planning were also stressed. And following the intergroup relations model, it also fostered interactions between Black and white community members and college students who spent time working on the project. Though the records also document more dangerous and violent events, and there is evidence in the archives on the surveillance of the center and its staff by the State of Mississippi Sovereignty Commission, showing how the records also create opportunities to identify and understand barriers to change. And finally, there are many examples of using education and dialogue in workshops, school programs, and conferences as a strategy to foster youth participation in civil rights and greater religious and racial understanding. I only have time to present a couple of brief examples on this today. The first is the All-South Human Relations Conference, documented in the United States Youth Council records. The conference was held in May 1963 at the University of North Carolina and hosted by the Young Adult Council, a national youth leadership organization. The theme was "The South into the Mainstream." This pilot project promoted dialogue between youth organizations and was billed as an exchange of ideas from all sides of issues confronting the South. Taking place in the South during the civil rights and Jim Crow eras makes for an interesting background for this conference. However, it's not clear how much actual debate occurred. The final report noted that most organizations sent what they called more liberal delegates, and that therefore not all viewpoints were actually represented. If you want to explore how the delegates engaged with the conference, their evaluation forms are available in the records. The National Teenage Conference on Human Rights, held in August 1964 at Princeton University, included 150 youth delegates from 35 states. Delegates listened to speeches on political issues and social action from leaders of groups such as the Urban League and the Congress of Racial Equality. There were educational and cultural events and training on civil rights action and group communication. The main focus was workshops for youth task forces, and these produced more resolutions and recommendations than I can summarize here, but I have a few examples from each. Education. All religious, racial, and ethnic groups should be covered in the school curriculum. Employment. Take action to improve equality through education. Housing. The importance of fair housing and addressing tactics such as blockbusting that were used to undermine property values. Law. Support for civilian review boards, human relations training in law enforcement, opposing redlining, and calling for the reinforcement of Native American treaty rights. Political action. Voicing support for the Civil Rights Act and encouraging civic participation by young people who, remember, cannot vote at this time. Religion and race say that everyone should agree, and I'm quoting now, not to participate in or patronize any facility, organization, or business that practices discrimination. My second case study focuses on Black power movements and the work of Black social workers for systems change in social welfare organizations. It was a challenge to do justice to these examples of anti-racism from the archives in a short talk. I focus on 1968 to the early 1970s, when Black social workers, educators, and students brought Black power theories and methods to bear on established systems and disrupted the discourse at the national level. These groups confronted social workers to evaluate their own perceptions of their mission, role, and status. Immediately prior to this period, many in the profession had engaged in civil rights programs such as those that I just described, and now the profession was being called into account and challenged, regardless of that legacy. Common themes emerge across the sources, including meet actual client needs and empower clients, reform curriculum, accrediting processes, policy and program priorities, meaningful input from communities served, address the impact of neocolonialism and white racism, and see racism as a barrier to change, membership participation in governance and decision-making, and prioritizing organizational support for social action over internal administration. Revisit financial priorities and fund meeting attendance and Black social worker participation in the organization. Center race in training and policy, and a strengths-based approach to work with communities of color. The first example is the Council on Social Work Education Caucus of Black Social Work Educators and its Black Task Force. In 1969, the caucus used the national arena of the council's annual program meeting to address racial inequities in social work education. Along with the Black Students Caucus and other interest groups, they took their demands to the House of Delegates meeting on the last day of the conference. A press release described the meeting as characterized by strong expression of controversial and conflicting views and by vigorous discussion. The minutes of the meeting included 13 pages of resolutions and demands, including the Student Caucus statement that the CSWE in structure is a subtle form of white racism. The Black Caucus called for more effective use of the skills, academic competencies, and ethnic experiences of the caucus members to respond to demands for more enlightened social work career preparation. In June 1970, CSWE hosted a workshop on incorporating Black community needs into the curriculum. Participants defined goals that closely reflected the earlier demands of the caucus. And the records also show the caucus busy collecting and producing reading lists, curriculum guides, and evaluating social work curriculum from the Black perspective. CSWE also created task forces to address specific educational issues for groups, including Black social workers. In 1972, the council received, Council received a small National Institutes of Mental Health grant to enrich the curriculum relevant to the Black community. The Black Task Force was founded right around this time, so the funding may have gone directly to its work. The task force of 15 practitioners, faculty, and students was established under the Council's Commission on Minority Groups and held its first meeting in January 1972 at the Atlanta University School of Social Work. Members were charged with identifying problems, outlining a methodology, soliciting knowledge from other Black social work educators, developing curriculum, and promoting more diverse faculty and students. Task force reports would be public to guide social work education, as well as the profession more generally. The task force worked on developing a conceptual framework for Black-focused social work education that included the impact of discrimination and alienation created by an apartheid system in the United States. James Hackshaw, who was tasked with developing guidelines on what would be covered in the curriculum, expressed his goal of examining more critically some of the current cliches that are passed off as Black culture. The proposed curriculum also included analysis of Black change agent styles based on the work of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., Malcolm X, and others. The task force was intentional about not settling for Black-related curriculum as an add-on, and called for it to be core to social work education and to specifically address white racism in social work. The task force issued what was essentially a final summary report in 1973, and in it, they called out the need for commitment from the entire social work education community, adequate funding, minority staffing, and integrating Black-created content in a comprehensive and substantive way. And it cites barriers to success in implementing all task force goals, including the pervasiveness of racism in American society, that many white social work educators continue to view the integration of Black content as a non-scholarly endeavor, and the lifelong exposure of Black social workers to trauma from racism and the resulting centrality of the Black experiences and systemic racism, applying them to specific areas of the curriculum, including human behavior content that addresses the impact of slavery and that fosters an understanding of how social work has grossly misrepresented Black client systems. a social policy curriculum that acknowledges the role of neocolonialism, institutional racism, and structures of power and privilege. The Black Task Force was not the only group to place racism and the Black experience at the center of social work. The National Association of Black Social Workers' first national conference in February 1969 was titled "The Black Family, Basic Unit of Survival Towards the Development of a Theory of Liberation." The conference announcement stated, "We are creating a national conference of Black social workers. Fundamental to the creation of this organization was our intense dissatisfaction with a class position and a kind of training that has separated us from the Black community. The Black family is our basic social unit. Myths and inaccuracies have served to confuse our view of this unit we so frequently serve. We must reorient our own view and subsequently the Black community's view of our own family structures." Another example is multiple actions at the National Conference on Social Welfare by around 20 organizations and caucuses between 1968 and 1970, including the National Association of Black Social Workers. These groups fought to address broader social issues as well as programmatic and governance systems within the organization, using the annual meeting as a platform. These were not isolated incidents, but rather ongoing disruptions of public forums with over 8,000 attendees in 1968 and 7,000 in 1969. Their demands included Black membership on all committees, focusing future conferences on white racism, voting and membership reforms, reorganizing the conference so that both providers and users of social services attended, and making it more social action oriented. Though leadership was conflicted over their methods and none too happy about the confrontational takeover of the 1969 plenary session and its 1,500 delegates, the records indicate that these movements did result in constitutional amendments, including directing conference priorities to more social action, subsidizing 50 members from emerging groups to participate in planning, and providing 400 free registrations. And possibly as much as $8,000 of the budget was dedicated to creating more inclusive participation in the conference. And I'm going to wrap up with two examples from the National Federation of Settlements and Neighborhood Centers, the organization representing the majority of community centers in primarily poor urban neighborhoods across the United States, which experienced a series of direct challenges to organizational systems and structures in the late 60s and early 1970s. The Federation's annual conference in Houston in May 1968 was the site of a Black Power workshop by the Black Caucus. It's not clear if it was spontaneous or pre-planned, but again, Black social workers were bringing their priorities to the forefront in a national venue. Here are just a few examples of demands and goals developed in the workshop. There were specific hiring goals, including having a Black staff person at the national level to network with partners and constituents, basically placing Black staff at the center of power and networking relationships. More representative conference planning, developing resources on race relations that were created by Black staff, and for the Federation to reaffirm its position in reference to the strengths inherent in being different as it relates to race, religion, and ethnic groups. And then they called for everyone to withhold their dues until the national organization started meeting these demands. The minutes of the annual business meeting at the same 1968 conference show proposed amendments to the social policy platform. This is not a complete list. It was a very long list of amendments. But delegates urged the Federation to call on the federal government to eradicate racism and the vestiges of poverty and discrimination, to create meaningful and appropriate minority history, culture, and contributions curriculum and eliminate prejudiced educational materials, create need-based, subsidized, or tuition-free public college or vocational training, and have anti-drug education and less punitive programs for drug users, and the list goes on. The workshop also appears to have impacted the Federation's New Directions Committee, which had been created around early 1968. The committee was charged with developing priorities on the urban scene and a plan of action for the Federation. It conducted brainstorming sessions with local groups, asked local agencies to submit their ideas for the organization's future, and collaborated with other Federation committees to review voting, finances, and training practices. Committee documents show discussion on the Black workshop recommendations, including revising membership standards, changing how conferences are planned, and acknowledging that the mood of the times is for involvement in action, so the Federation should act accordingly, helping local agencies with race relations, and working on white racist attitudes. Some Black Caucus members were skeptical about whether the national office would ever act and whether the new committee would do anything other than stir the soup. And there is further evidence of dissatisfaction with how systemic racism was being addressed. For example, the document, The Demands of the Black Caucus of the Conference on Inner City Violence, held in Chicago, October 1968, which were submitted to Executive Director Margaret Berry, stated that the conference had systematically failed to deal with the issues or genesis of the racist and fascist tendencies encountered by the communities in which we function. And the list of demands directly calls out racism, lack of Black leadership, and economics as barriers to change, and calls on the Federation to acknowledge that communities are facing conflict and violence and to help agencies address that. At the same time that Black Caucus members were proposing systems change in the national organization, they also set in motion the idea for a national meeting for social workers and clients from communities of color, which became the Technoculture Conference, first held in February of 1970. The conference called for common priorities and action strategies, including community control, neighborhood organizations, a national network of human resources and financial resources, and coordination with the New Directions program, all within a framework of fighting to overcome the corroding impact of white racism. In a great example of finding a gem in the archives, the Technoculture Files include an undated paper on the theory and methods of Black caucuses in American institutions that contains an entire section entitled Etiquette for Whites. I only have time to paraphrase and list a few, and I am paraphrasing here, but the instructions include: maintain compassion and sensitivity, don't use sarcasm, don't presume on old Black-white relationships, go along with semantic rules, and don't feel bad if your actions in the civil rights movement aren't counted in your favor. And now I'm quoting directly. The results are puny indeed compared to what the accomplishments must be. That is why the Black Power emerged as one response to the failure of progress. So more work is needed to understand the level of success or failure of these and other movements, and there are extensive documents waiting to be used to explore these questions in the archives. And while researching this talk, I was struck by the timely themes and goals, and I hope that these records of past anti-racist work might be a resource to inform current conversations. And I'm now going to hand things off to my colleague, Ryan Bean, reference and outreach archivist in the Couts Family YMCA Archives, who will now share how they are using records in the archives to disrupt institutional narratives.
Thank you, Linnea. I'm really struck with your presentation how relevant it is to current events today, and it really makes you wonder all these missed moments and what could have been had things been different. And that's sort of the theme that I'm going to run with on this presentation of Context Matters, or the longest subtitle in history, Disrupting the Narrative in Support of Advancing an Institutional Journey Towards Becoming an Anti-Racist Multicultural Organization. So hello, my name is Ryan Bean, and I'm the reference and outreach archivist for the Couts Family YMCA Archives. And we support the Young Men's Christian Association, or YMCA, and the work that we've been doing this past year in helping them pursue their goals of becoming an anti-racist multicultural organization. So as I said, context matters, and so I should probably provide you all with a bit of context. The YMCA itself was organized in 1844 in London, England. In 1851, it arrived in the United States. And by 1877, a man by the name of Jacob T. Bound began collecting YMCA materials. There was no school of social work, no physical education degrees. The pioneering work that YMCA workers were conducting, they were making it up from whole cloth and borrowing from other social-minded individuals. And so Bound, to advance his own development, began to collect materials related to YMCA and other social agencies to better understand the nature of the work. That collection proved so valuable that it was brought in 1890 to the newly opened YMCA training school to actually begin to standardize the training methodology of what is a YMCA worker, what are the services that they offer. That history, or early history, formed the first generation of YMCA secretaries. And the material was so valuable to the movement, the YMCA movement as they called themselves at the time, that a significant chunk of it was taken away from Springfield College and brought to the newly built YMCA headquarters in New York City in 1908. There it remained for many, many years until in 1980, the YMCA relocated to its headquarters in Chicago, and the archives were put in storage at that time. In 1985, they came to the University of Minnesota. And in 1996, the archives were named in honor of Richard Couts and his family, who made a very generous donation to help preserve the collection. So all archives are special collections, and people come to archives for a variety of reasons. For the YMCA, they have long looked to the archives for inspiration. And with over 175 years of history, there are many achievements worth celebrating, from the invention of basketball and volleyball, the formation of the Far Eastern Games, service in times of war, mass education, spiritual development, and John Mott, a towering figure in YMCA history who received the Nobel Peace Prize. The Y also requests substantial amounts of information from the archives, particularly with regards to organizational evolution and legal issues. They also, pre-COVID, requested throughout the year presentations that can help inform their agenda. More sober accounts than the rah-rah of inventing basketball that seek to contextualize or possibly disrupt, though frankly it was more of a nudge, narratives. These presentations were intended to construct a mirror that asks, to what extent are we influenced by the past, to help them more clearly see themselves where they are today and make better informed decisions as to where they want to be tomorrow. Well, when COVID hit last spring, this work became immediately in high demand, starting with short essays on the 1918 flu pandemic and the Great Depression posted to their YMCA networks. We shared perspectives from the archives intended not to diminish the trauma of lockdown, but rather to highlight the resilience of their organization and to provide a source of inspiration as they decided how to respond. As a result of this work, the National Board of the YMCA requested a presentation on times the Y was presented with crisis and lessons learned. So this presentation ultimately served as a catalyst for a strategic planning committee that was beginning its work, offering up that while we've never been here before, we have certainly been in similar spaces. And the lessons offered were that the COVID-19 pandemic has caused massive disruption to every aspect of our lives. However, when we look at the past, we can see that American society and the YMCA has weathered each and every crisis. Some of these crises dramatically changed the YMCA. Others had possibly a more subtle effect. Some came seemingly out of nowhere, while others had been simmering for quite some time. Each offer an opportunity for reflection, and some may provide useful perspectives for this current crisis. We lasered in on a handful of specific examples to take a deeper dive. World War I, where the YMCA took the lead. The 1918 flu pandemic, for all the obvious reasons, where the Y rallied communities. The Great Depression, where the Y constantly had to adapt. Civil rights, where the Y was working behind the scenes. And the modern challenge of tax challenges, where the Y wakes up to its mission. It's interesting, though not surprising, that though civil rights was offered up as a lesson, at that time, the Great Depression garnered the most discussion at the time, which makes a certain measure of sense given the massive layoffs and shuttering many YMCAs were facing as a result of their being heavily dependent on membership revenue. And so we ended this presentation adding COVID to that timeline as an indicator that undoubtedly more will come. What none of us realized was that the next crisis would be elevated to their attention a couple months later. The Archives has long supported the work of the National Y's Diversity, Inclusion, and Global Department, and there exists strong collaborative relationships between us and the Y. As the pandemic persisted, the issue of long existing systemic inequality was elevated within the Y, and parts of the organization that offer services, such as housing, reached out for some historical perspective. Then, with the murder of George Floyd and the subsequent social reckoning, understanding that this history became an organizational imperative. And so in collaboration with the Y, we reviewed the past presentations and dug deeper, taking the message beyond the nudge of the past and presenting a sober assessment of where they have been and how that informs where they are going. So this is their journey from exclusion to equity. In reflecting on each phase of that journey, I attempted to recast those steps as a frame. And so these are the first 4 frames that I believe are critical for advancing the American YMCA's equity journey. And that without considering their impact, legacy, and degree of presence today, leaves a very real barrier to the full realization of their mission. And so the breakdown of these 4 frames are that the Y was created to support white, middle, and upper middle class men. Makes sense. The full name of the YMCA when formed in 1844 was the Young Men's Christian Association for those engaged in the drapery and other trades. So it was initially a rather restricted group. Prospective members needed a recommendation from an existing member, and groups of members would interview your family, church, and colleagues to ensure your Christian character. The point of this is twofold. First, it demonstrates how much the Y has changed from its first meetings. And second, it serves as a reminder that its activities flow from that origin. The second one, in the United States, when the YMCAs were formed in non-white communities, it was frequently initiated through white intermediaries. In many ways, an extension of the first, it's simply saying that by and large, new Ys were formed through white intermediaries, creating a power dynamic that's worth exploring. The third, that the YMCA at a national level has in the past prioritized the study of racial issues affecting the movement and communities it serves. This frame reminds that issues are not new, nor are they new to the YMCA, and that in fact there is a tremendous precedent to not only discuss race and racism, but also to study, collaborate, and implement policies and programs to disrupt it. The big picture is that this is not new work. And lastly, the American YMCA is part of our nation's racism and racist systems. By this point in the presentation, hopefully this point was belabored. By walking through the journey, we demonstrate that the history that the Y has a capacity to be both racist and anti-racist, and that if the Y wishes to become anti-racist, by their own framework and methodology as an organization, they need to confront and reckon with their history. These 4 frames were rolled up in a final frame that summarizes and expanded upon. And for me, this is why history matters. The more we know about how these systems came to be, the more we can do to dismantle them by seeing them for what they are, a series of choices made and not made. And this is where archives, especially institutional archives, are supremely situated to support and catalyze organizational change. To the American Y's credit, they have embraced this work. New board members now receive this information as part of their onboarding process, and it continues to drive internal conversation and decision-making. They have also partnered with the World Alliance of YMCAs to bring this work to the attention of the global Y movement. 2 weeks ago, I was fortunate to share this work as part of the 81st meeting of the World YMCA Executive Committee. Given the impact and legacy of the American YMCA globally, over half the Ys across the globe are the result of American YMCA missionaries who sought to evangelize to the world in a generation. We sought to construct global questions to the American story, asking along the way, to what extent does this ring true today? And so we added on global dimensions to the US history. So the frames of the Y being created to serve predominantly white middle-class families and extending its presence through white intermediaries globally shows up in that during the late 19th and 20th century, these white men spread the YMCA across the globe following colonial and missionary routes. In many countries, there were initially YMCAs set up to serve primarily Western colonial populations. And later, through missionary enterprises, were YMCAs initiated for indigenous populations. We offer these up to ask the question, to what extent does this ring true today, and what is the impact of this formative moment? The frame that in the past, at a national level, the Y has prioritized and studied issues affecting the movement and the communities it serves, globally exposes a deep level of institutional hypocrisy. And that at the global level, the YMCA long advocated for many of the themes that Linnea referenced in her presentation of brotherhood, global unity, and cooperation, while completely and largely neglecting segregation and discrimination and racism in the United States, a sort of do as we say, not as we do sort of premise. And lastly, that the American YMCA is a part of our nation's racism and racist systems. And so globally, we asked, to what extent does racism, colonialism, missionary efforts, and other issues impact the ability of the global YMCA to achieve its goals? To what extent do these inform our goals? And perhaps this is the most challenging frame to internalize for the Y, that it is the American YMCA is part of our nation's racism and racist past. Though as much as that concept may cause discomfort, not acknowledging and addressing the ways racism presents itself in the YMCA not only perpetuates a grave injustice, it allows it to spread and evolve, taking on new forms. And so this was the call to action, co-created by the World Alliance of YMCAs and the American YMCA, supported by the archives. The request was for the YMCA movement to prioritize cultivating an understanding of the global dimensions of racism, xenophobia, and bigotry, and to identify both unique ways they present across the globe and to highlight common forms of discriminations. The dialogue was rich and contained the diversity of thought one would expect from approximately 60 attendees representing over 25 nations. Most importantly, it served as a launching point for a series of events and conversations leading up to the 2022 meeting of the World Alliance of YMCAs, where the Global Y movement convenes to conduct its work. So what have I learned over this past year? Archives and archivists have tremendous power to disrupt narratives. I know me and my colleagues have a short list in our minds of collections, resources, and materials we're just waiting for the right researcher to get their hands on, to bring these narratives to light, to disrupt the narratives. And so archivists have an active role, especially in an institutional setting, to bring these narratives to the attention of organizational leaders, of where it's relevant to their work. And disruption can be good for the archives. For many years, that we have attempted to better integrate our work with that of the YMCA. And though I wish the context for this deepened integration over this past year were different, there is definitely a silver lining as a result of the need for context and perspective. And ultimately, and I think Linnea's presentation really underscores this, timing matters and windows of opportunity are short-lived. And this has been an overarching theme for the work that we've presented to the YMCA, is to show the pernicious nature of this issue and the high frequency with which it rises to the surface, and questions to what extent are we maintainers of the status quo versus agents of change. So thank you.
Thank you, Ryan, and thank you, Linnea, for those very interesting and timely presentations. Just proof that what goes around comes around. I'll remind everyone that if you have a question for our presenters today, please type it into the Q&A button at the bottom. We don't have any questions at present, but I'll give you a few moments here to type things in. I guess I could start off with a question to Ryan. Ryan, what was the real catalyst for the Y taking a hard look at its history? Was it George Floyd or was it before that? This has been going on for a little while, I think.
Yeah, I think a big part of what happened is as a result of the social unrest following George deployed is that their diversity, inclusion, and global department was given a larger platform. And so as I've referenced over the years, I've given a series of presentations on themes that are related to race and racism within the YMCA, helping to advance that type of work. And as I referenced that during the presentation, the social inequity that COVID was really bringing to the forefront of many white people's attention for the first time sort of gave it a high priority. And so as I was collaborating, working with them, and really through conversation, we kept returning back to these themes. And so at that point, I circled back in my past presentations, cobbled it together and gave sort of a deep dive, warts and all, this is what your history is. And at that moment, they decided to elevate that up to the board and to help advance the work of that department. So it's really in a collaboration of the archives with their diversity department to help accelerate and catalyze internal conversations. And then from there, it just sort of flowed into a variety of ways. Thank you for that.
Thanks. We do have some questions coming in. The first one is, what about women in scouting? When did that start? Do we know?
I should, because I used to be a Girl Scout, but the Girl Scouts of the USA actually have they keep their own archives, and it's in New York City. So there's probably a lot of good stories to be explored there. But yes, the concept of scouting for women followed, I think, pretty shortly on the formation of scouting for boys.
Thanks, Linnea. A question, does the source of archives affect the portrait they create? If yes, what remedies are at hand? Great question.
Yeah, Ryan, do you mind if I jump in on that one first? That is a fantastic question. I'm going to have to make an assumption about what you mean by source, sort of who created the archive, what kind of organization. Yes, that absolutely can impact the records that are at hand. So did the organization understand the importance of its own history, for example, with the YMCA, and therefore preserve it and send it to an archive, or did they not? In which case you may have only gaps and bits and pieces of the story. Also, what did the organization consider important or not important to record in their documents? So does it reflect really only their internal concerns? Does it not have a diverse picture of the organization? So the people who created the documents, their priorities, and frankly, their prejudices really can impact the nature of the records. And then another way that the source impacts what kind of material you see in the archives is this a large organization? Is it a grassroots organization? Is it professionally run? Does it have a lot of resources to produce a ton of documents and really slick materials and buy the latest technology, which in 1900 was the typewriter, right? Or later on, a Xerox machine. Or is it getting by on a shoestring? Is it writing flyers by hand, running things off on a mimeograph at the local library or something? And so that really kind of creates a character. You kind of get to know the organization and its people through the texture and the type of the records. So those are just a few ways that the source impacts what's in the archive. So I hope that begins to address your question.
I could add to that, Linnea. Yes to everything Linnea said, and in particular with an institutional archive, as Linnea presented and I sort of alluded to through my work, this information's there anyway. It's buried, it may be folded up in other places, and that's really where archivists sort of who know their collections and the institutions and people they represent of how to sort of navigate those spaces. And particularly with an institutional archive, I'd also offer up that in addition to the source of the collection, the questions that are asked of the collections also shape their identity and sort of presence, become sort of the standard narrative, which is sort of the point of what we're trying to offer here is disrupting these standard narratives. And it really highlights the importance of continuously looking back and asking questions of the past from our current frames and what can we learn from that. I'll give a quick example for the why. is they would long held up their role in the civil rights movement and how Dr. King stayed at the YMCA. And soon into coming to the archives, I would share with them, well, you understand you stayed at the segregated YMCAs, and that's a really big important piece of information that's missing from this statement. And so it's also a challenge to not be flippant with history and historical facts, and to really be centered in how and why you're using information. So as much as the creators shape the narrative, we as consumers and interpreters of history have an equal role.
Thanks to both of you. I think that answers the question really well. We have some support being voiced about providing these recordings to social workers, today's social workers, so that they can see a bit of their history. Not a bad idea. Once we get these up on the YouTube channel, maybe people will find these. Also, a question about any information on the YWCA through a racial lens. And I suspect the YWCA's records, which are, Linnea, do you know where they are?
Yes, we have the records in the Social Welfare History Archives of the Minneapolis YWCA, and there is some information in there on their work on civil rights and sort of racial understanding and racial justice. So that's a really interesting collection. The records of the National YWCA are located in the Sophia Smith collection at Smith College. It's an archival collection on the history of women. And I just answered that reference question right off the top of my head, but I answer it a lot for people. So I would encourage folks to take a look at that collection. I'm sure it's fantastic. And a good portion of the YWCA of Minneapolis records are actually available online in our UMedia digital content site. So if folks are interested in that, they can follow up with me.
A significant amount of the material at Smith College has been digitized as well, and they're continuing to roll it out. So
fantastic.
Yeah, so go explore. Question, you've shown us how attempts to diminish racism have shown a sort of repetition, move forward, then pause or retreat. Are there similarities in the retreats as well as in the advances? Do the same anti-progressive forces repeatedly come into play?
That is a fantastic question. Ryan, did you want to go first, or?
Sure. Yeah. In many ways, that's the thrust of the work that I'm doing, is to present this pattern and to offer up the question. Honestly, I don't know. It's partially our role is to provide sort of this overview and an encouragement for a deep dive. I'm very sensitive to not have any of these presentations having me walk away with a, okay, I got it, checkbox, move on. It's more to create discomfort and questioning and deeper dives. And what it seems like, and at least in the pattern with the YMCA, is systems more evolve and rather than go away. And the power dynamics come in. There's an initiative, and then it fades, something happens, and then there's a new initiative. And it frequently, at least within the YMCA, what I saw, the urgency and the attention is tied to white concerns of social unrest. And when those fears are alleviated, the attention seems to go away. And so this is where we're presenting it today, is to say, do you want to be yet another maintainer of the status quo, or do you seek to actually disrupt the narrative the first time? And putting the onus on them to ask and figure out what can that look like. So transparently with the Y is I'm encouraging them to pursue a truth and reconciliation process that inherently involves a collaborative of community members, scholars, archivists, everybody to dig into the collections and to answer more clearly exactly questions like that. What is going on with this issue?
And then to follow up on Ryan's answer, briefly, the short answer is yes, those stories are also in the archive. So there are the moments of disruption, and those are often documented, not always, of course, but there are many collections in these national social work organizations that include documents such as minutes, conference proceedings, correspondence back and forth between officers of the organization. And sometimes you can see specific responses to these movements and to these groups where it's being discussed at the sort of institutional or organizational level. What do we do, right? And then sometimes what you see really is just sort of the expanding prevalence again of business as usual. Right. And so I think it definitely is something that should and could be researched in the archives. And there's a couple of different ways that you could approach it. Are you looking at the organization as a whole, or are you looking at a specific event or a specific type of demand? And you want to see how that played out. But yes, we also often have this conversation with students and scholars who are using the archives of, I have heard this story before, I have experienced this at work. And now here it is, 100 years ago. And, for some people, that's very energizing and it feels like an opportunity for them. And for some people that is, we have to acknowledge that it's also very frustrating that they see that in the archives.
And I think we have time for one more question. There was a question about the Young Men's Hebrew Association. I don't know that any of our collections contain information about that organization, probably not even the Upper Midwest Jewish Archive, but I suspect that this organization is facing the same kinds of issues that most organizations are facing at this point. And then finally, how aggressively do archivists go after unofficial documents, those that were not put out by the institutions?
Another excellent question. And that one really points to something that we are grappling with in the profession, which is the role of the archivist as someone who selects and curates, sometimes it is the word that is used, and how does that impact the historical narrative? So yes, by their nature, sometimes grassroots organizations or protest organizations can be more difficult to document because there isn't a big national headquarters to put boxes in a closet and then send it to the archives 50 years later, right? But it also points out the importance of having collaborative relationships with communities and with groups who have important historical stories to tell and to document, whether those end up being documented in an archive or within the community itself. And this is really a very current conversation amongst archivists right now. So it's very interesting that you asked that question. Thank you.
One thing we do, we try to do sort of piecemeal at the Y Archives is to conduct oral history interviews with individuals, frequently retirees, but people across the board, as a way to sort of try to backfill and provide some insight and context beyond the organizational records. And this has been a problem that's well known within the Y Archives since the first comprehensive history of it was written in the 1950s, is that our collection can tell a very good story of what the YMCA did, but why it did it, why those individuals went about doing that is a completely different story. I think you're probably speaking a little more specifically about maybe disruptive narratives, but there's a whole host of narratives that intersect with the organizations that we document, and I try to be as open as possible into accepting those as they come in or they come to our attention.
Well, thank you, Linnea and Ryan and Alan and Jason and Mike. We're out of time for today, but please join us again on May 7th for a presentation from Upper Midwest Jewish Archives curator Kate Dietrich entitled "The Flying Jewish Chaplain." After serving as a military chaplain for the U.S. Army Air Force during World War II, Rabbi Harold H. Gordon became a circuit chaplain for the North Atlantic Division of the Air Transport Command. Nicknamed the Flying Jewish Chaplain, Rabbi Gordon logged over 200,000 air miles to bring spiritual guidance to members of the armed forces. And finally, a presentation by Amanda Wick, who organized and described the Carlson Company's corporate records and family papers. Her presentation is entitled "Kurt Carlson, the Ultra Entrepreneur." Kurt Carlson and his very successful businesses are a homegrown Minnesota success story. This talk will delve into the personal and professional life of Mr. Carlson and the incredible social networks that he built and participated in as he rose in prominence. Remember to check the library's YouTube channel in a few weeks for recordings of today's presentations. And thank you very much for joining us, and we'll see you next month.